All right, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. My name is Gabe Sanchez. I am the director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Center for Health Policy here at the University of New Mexico. If you're not familiar with us or you've never been to one of our talks, we are essentially a research center on campus that focuses specifically on racial and ethnic health disparities. So this talk, as all those we've had in recent memory, have really hit home to our mission, which is to try to use research to engage directly in policy, particularly racial and ethnic health disparities policy. Today, you'll see we have a tremendous speaker, Arline Geronimus from the University of Michigan. I'll tell you a little bit about her in a moment, but I want to give you kind of some foreshadowing for some other events we have coming up in the relatively near future. April 25th, we've got Dr. Marie Mora, an economist, University of Texas Pan American, also a member of our National Advisory Board, will be speaking, I believe, 2:30 that afternoon. That kind of closes out our National Advisory Board meeting. She hasn't given me the formal talk yet that she'll be giving, but as soon as she does, I'll make sure that that is sent out to this list that signed up so you get access to it. We are also excited to be partnering with the Institute of Medicine on a great program, Advancing Health Equity for Native American Youth. That'll take place May 6th at the Hotel Albuquerque. Same drill, anybody who wants direct information, sign up. I'll make sure you get that in your inbox as soon as that flyer is made available. That will be an all-day panel. Again, we're collaborating with IOM, a lot of really tremendous speakers that will be coming into Albuquerque for that event. As you see, today we are extremely pleased to have Dr. Arline Geronimus from the University of Michigan. She's a professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Health Education, School of Public Health there at the University of Michigan, and she also associate directs the Population Studies Center. If you're not aware of that center, they do amazing work. It's structured in the Institute for Social Research, or ISR, there at the University of Michigan. If you're not familiar with her work, you've been like hiding under a rock for quite a while. I mean, prolific scholar, publishes widely. I mean, one designation of the caliber of work, not just the number of publications, but the quality, is she was elected to the Institute of Medicine relatively recently, last year, I believe, 2013. So congratulations. That's a very rare club to get into. Her work focuses both on social and biological mechanisms that impact, particularly mediates the relationship between race and health. One of the papers that I know you've published with one of my colleagues recently, I'm extremely interested in as a political scientist. Long story short, they find that during Republican administration, population health doesn't do as well as in Democratic administrations. We were talking a little bit about this before. Interestingly, that paper generated more media attention for a published article, a research article, than any I've seen in quite some time. I mean, it really generated a lot of attention, which I think all of our PhD students can learn from as we try to train them in how do you actually use your research to have an impact and have that really go beyond the article that you're publishing that sits on the shelf. So that might be something that comes up in Q&A. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Geronimus. We are very pleased to have you here at the University of New Mexico. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm feeling enormous pressure to do a good job because everybody said such wonderful things. As for hiding under a rock, if you haven't heard my research, I don't know about that, but I know I've had to hide under rocks because of my research. So, but it's nice to know I'm among friends here. So I'm going to talk, I have sort of a broad talk, although I will focus on a specific paper midway through, but I'm going to do kind of a broader context for that paper, and also I'm going to use that paper, I think, to also make some commentary, implicit at least, and maybe explicit, on the nature of social epidemiological science and what's wrong with it. Excuse me. Okay, so I don't know why I called it this. I mean, I do know why I called it this, but in part it was just fluky that the day I was asked to send in a title, there had been a new intergovernmental report on climate change, and I was thinking about climate change. So I don't know if this will be the final name for this general discussion, but it at least served to get I guess the flyer made up for the talk. Anyway, any of you who weren't hiding under rocks and did look at my research know that I originated a theory called the weathering hypothesis, I guess, or framework. It changes all the time what to put after the word weathering. Phenomenon. So let me just say a little about it for those of you who may not be familiar with it at all. The weathering, I guess here I've called it a theory, is that socially structured repeated stressors or stress process activation, I should look at that one, huh? Or I should look down here. My eyes are getting old. Stress process activation can accumulate and increase health vulnerability across the life course in marginalized groups. And what I mean by repeated stress process activation is anything that triggers your physiological stress process. So it's not only, as many people operationalize it, perceived stress. It certainly can be perceived stress. It can also be perceived stress that leads to sustained cognitive and emotional engagement. So it's longer than the perception of the stress. But it can also be objective. And you're not necessarily aware of these stressors as they cause your body to activate its stress response. And by objective, I mean things like the weather, environmental toxins, noise, overcrowding, extremes of temperature. There's just a very big range of things that are encompassed under this concept of stressors that are not often considered when you hear about stress or when you measure stress. And even here, I'm not going to have any measures of some of those more environmental stressors, though we hope to be able to add some of them. But I did want you to understand that what I'm really talking about is anything that triggers, that activates that physiological process. And so when you see it in that broader light, you can see how stressors are structured for populations. And they're also more, I want to say, they're also more than poverty or material hardship, although that comes under this broad umbrella. But I think we've, as a group, tended to look at a very narrow set of the things under that umbrella. Another part of weathering, which many people miss, or maybe I haven't said enough about, or maybe because I knew I should hide under a rock about it, is weathering is not just about what happens to people's physical bodies because of structured stressors to which they're exposed. It's also about what they do collectively to mitigate, resist, or undo those harms or those potential harms. And so it's social, it's both how the environment affects your health and how then group health affects the strategies you use to survive and do your best to thrive in an environment that is rigged against you. And I say here that those responses can be shelter or storm. They're definitely, I believe, on balance, shelter, and that's why groups do them and continue to do them. But that doesn't mean two things that I think people sometimes misunderstand or I haven't been clear enough about. One is some of those are very stressful too. High effort coping is stressful. And the other is it doesn't mean that we don't need policy to, this is a good kind of maybe Rube Goldberg satisfy situation rather than drowning, but it's more like the little flotation device you're holding on so you don't drown. I mean, I don't want to make it sound that trivial because it's not trivial at all, but I don't want it to get romanticized either into that, so we don't need any social policy or public health policy because groups will just adapt and they'll figure out their own interesting and rich cultural ways to adapt. And the other part is because weathering leads to these adaptations in social and even family structure, the broader society, I argue, doesn't understand or sees those differences not as differences or as sensible differences, or responsive or adaptive differences, they see it as more signs that the marginalized group is pathological or deficient in some way. And the policies they often come up with often then actually disrupt the autonomous protections, which creates new stressors. So that's sort of the general weathering model. And there's sort of an underlying part to all of it too, which I don't always say out loud, but I'm guessing I can say it here, which is that I think that health comes from a sense of rootedness in an affirmation of cultural values, practices, affective ties, and beliefs that give life purpose and meaning, and not just from material resources. And that one of the main things that being marginalized does is I want to say futzes, but I think that's not a word. If we were in New York, you'd get it. It plays with your sense of validation and affirmation and how to feel good about your cultural values, and it just causes, it's just undermining of this part of what I think is very important for health. So in terms of the weathering hypothesis, as I first started calling it, I was then focusing my work, as I did for a very long time, on African Americans. So initially the work I did was sort of African Americans, sometimes compared to white, sometimes within black heterogeneity by poverty or rural-urban status, but initially I didn't look at other populations. More recently, I have, and also many of my students have sort of gone out and tried and applied weathering in various ways. And it's not like a little hammer you can nail on any population. Part of why I resisted for a long time moving to other populations is I felt I had spent a lot of time understanding historically and in terms of socially situated knowledge, how African Americans might weather, or ones located in different places of the, whether geographic or material or economic. And so I didn't think you could just jump to another population. And so I've been happy to have students who are more interested in other populations take that baton. So, so at its most simple sort of quantitative level, the weathering hypothesis was the health vulnerability of African Americans begins to increase in youth. I started studying this as a result of work I had been doing on teenage childbearing, so I started with youth. But obviously you can talk about things that happen in utero or in childhood, and more people have begun to do that. It deteriorates at an accelerated rate, and it's a physical manifestation of the cumulative impact of repeated experience with social exclusion, material hardship, and related stressors. And again, those stressors could be psychosocial, environmental, anything that's kind of a biological challenge to homeostasis. You can also tell from that that different groups and different individuals within groups might weather more or less than others. So just to make this stark, I will start with just showing you some early work. The weathering hypothesis sort of suggests that over prolonged exposure to stress hormones would have effects that would cause early onset and pernicious progression of stress-related diseases such as hypertension, allostatic load, which is stress-mediated wear and tear, functional limitations, work disabilities, personal care disability, accelerated aging, which is what I'm mostly going to focus on today, and excess death. And we've studied sort of this whole litany, but starting with hypertension. And so just to give you a very kind of black and white idea about, well, maybe not. Am I doing this wrong? Okay. Someone want to help? Did it move?
Yes.
I see what the problem is. The problem is also I must have a different version. I kept changing the slides around and I think I have the wrong one printed out. But that's okay. We'll figure it out. So the idea is then that the stress inherent in living in a race-conscious society may cause blacks, or whatever group you're focusing on that's marginalized, to experience the morbidity and mortality of whites who are significantly older. So that's the accelerated aging dimension. And so if we look at hypertension prevalence, here's my very clear, or simple, I won't say clear, simple example. The weathering hypothesis would predict that age trajectories of hypertension prevalence through middle age would be steeper for black than white Americans, with a wider racial gap in hypertension prevalence in middle age than at younger ages. And that's exactly what we see. And I've redone this the first time I did this was using the 1976 to 1980 Haynes, which I guess ages me. And we've done it periodically since then. But we always get the same general pattern, although the levels change, which I think is related to this issue of it depends how much weathering. So this is just an example, the prevalence of hypertension in black women versus white women. And I'm supposed to carry this with me when I walk. And what I want to point out is that there's very little difference in so-called youth. And then it gets bigger and bigger. It becomes very detectable by around the mid-20s, larger and larger, and is biggest in the sort of young adult through middle ages. I call that's come to be called a weathering pattern. So when we see that, it's sort of a weathering pattern. As I said, we've seen it for decades and in other health outcomes, many other health outcomes as well. But it does change in the sense that these are both curves are black women comparing the NHANES 3, which is the lower one, to the NHANES 4. Those were done about 10 years apart. You can see in those 10 years, the pattern stayed the same, but the levels and acceleration got worse. And for those of you who might be curious, even though I'm not really going to talk about this, this is the most recent ones we've done. And you see it again. Here I put men and women, because I think there's some interesting things here that often surprise people, including that the people with the highest levels of hypertension are black women. I think most people, conventional wisdom is it's black men. But in the young ages, the black women are about the same as the black men, a little less. But then they converge, and then they overtake them. And I think that's very interesting. And white women have the lowest risks, but then they kind of cross over, or at least converge with white men by middle age. So hypertension is not just, a man or a black man's problem, but that's weathering. I want to talk a little about weathering and identity safety or social identity threat. It's one of the many factors I would put under things that activate your stress process, but I think it's an important one that I'm going to really focus on it today, both because I think people don't usually talk about it. So it's not that it's the most important or the only one, but we've all heard about income or, smoking or BMI or those things. This is one that I think is less often thought about in this context and is very structural. And I think is very related to policy in the sense of if we could disrupt some of these social identity threats, I think that would be an important step towards reducing, at least if not eliminating, health inequality. So the argument for this goes something like population health vulnerability is shaped by a society's response to observable characteristics that define socially constructed groups. That's just sort of basic stuff you all know. But it's also shaped by the group's response to the social contingencies that follow, and that includes the autonomous protections, the responses, the adaptations, et cetera. But the constructs of race or ethnicity, or it could be gender or LGBTQ, or I'm trying to list all the things my students are doing, and their health implications, that is how they become biological, are relational, dynamic, they vary with the setting, the situation, the historical moment, and context. And when I say these things vary in those ways, I mean both that the exposures or the things to which you're exposed will vary with those things, but also whether or not you have established autonomous protections to deal with exposures will vary across populations or within populations in different settings, and whether there are cues in your environment to stereotype threat or identity safety in specific settings will vary, and it can vary in the same person's daily rounds. The health effects can be rapid, cumulative, and enduring, and the health impacts of social identity, such as race, are fluid and mutable. And that, I wanted to highlight that point, that I think whether you think it's something biologically essential or a social construction, most research seems to interpret race as a fixed characteristic and just a characteristic of a person. And what I'm trying to suggest is that to the extent it affects one's health, one of the ways it works would be through social identity safety, and whether or not you're subject to stereotype threat or to identity safety, or where in between, or how often which, because again, in a given day, probably any of you can imagine, you walk into one place and you're self-conscious about being a woman, say, and that's on your mind, and you walk into another, and everybody's a woman, and everybody's welcoming, and it sort of doesn't have that same effect. And I take these notions from Claude Steele, who you may know of. He's a social psychologist, and he sort of came up with the concept and has really studied extensively, both in labs and classrooms, of stereotype threat, where he and his colleagues have shown over and over again that it affects performance on a variety of things. Most of their work has been on academic tests, which is important for policy too, in terms of high stakes testing and these ideas of accountability through testing. And it's also important because to the extent it affects your ability to proceed in your education or do well in your education, that will affect your socioeconomic position and some of the material parts of what may hold some populations back from being more healthy. The concept of contingencies of social identity affect what social identity is foregrounded and how it is experienced in a particular setting. So that's the example I was giving of, in one place as a woman, I'm self-conscious or worried or busy figuring out how I'm going to present myself, and in another, it doesn't matter. Maybe in another, it's something I'm celebrating. So, and the way Steele put it, I thought was apt. If there is nothing in these settings that you have to deal with because you are a woman or black or older or have a Spanish accent, then these characteristics will not become important social identities for you in that setting. There'll be characteristics you have, you might cherish them for a variety of reasons, but in that setting, they won't much affect how you see things, whom you identify with, how you react emotionally to events in the setting, whom you relate to easy, and so on. They won't become central to whom you are there. And the primes and cues to these different social identities are remarkably simple ones. So for instance, in the case of testing, one study found that if all you did was ask the demographic question, are you female or male, after the AP calculus test instead of before, so it's just, when you're busy checking these things off, you're probably not thinking this is affecting your test performance in any way. And that's the other point about these stressors. You don't necessarily have to perceive them at all, even when what they're working on is your brain. But they estimated that if they put that at the end, about 5,000 more girls would score high enough to receive AP credit each year. Another study looked at Asian women, and in one set of, randomly controlled trial, in one set they were reminded that they were Asian, and the other that they were female. before they were given a math test, and when they were reminded they were Asian, they performed better than the control group, and when they were reminded they were female, they performed worse. And one of the really scary things about it is these investigators, she et al., continue to work on this and even found this in 5-year-old girls. So how quick this priming happens is pretty remarkable. Okay. Oh, at the screen. Thank you. Okay. And I also just want to highlight that all of us are subject to this in some way or another. Obviously, it's of more import for some groups than others, but all our bodies would do the same things. And they've found, and this one I resonate to, intellectual performance by elderly individuals can be disrupted by stereotypes suggesting that their mental abilities are on the decline. White athletes jump higher in all white teams than in integrated teams. White men who usually do the best in all these things, but when they're in the threat condition in randomized controlled trials, perform better than women or blacks, if that's who they're being compared to, but perform worse than Asian men. So those of you who read one of the articles I sent, this will be familiar to you, but I thought a nice kind of anecdote that kind of highlights this I saw John Amici give a talk at Diversity Incorporated, and I could barely write it fast enough. He, as you may know, was an NBA player and a big star when he was at Penn State on their basketball team. And so he's telling the story. In the Big Ten, I ended up a bit of a star. And I got very used to walking around campus and having people respond to me in this really effusive way. I started to really, really enjoy it. I would walk around campus and people would yell, "Meech, yeah, this is cool. We had a good game the night before walking to class. Meech, good game. You know it." And then one day I was walking just off campus and I was really feeling good about my life and everything I was achieving. A car goes by, window winds down, jams the brakes. I've got my hand right here, ready to wave to this adoring fan. And all of a sudden, out of the window, this kid goes, N-word. It affected everything. Some random kid in the back of a crappy car that I can't even describe, someone I've never seen since, someone I had certainly not met before, yells that word out of the window, and my world kind of crushed. There I was, an athlete at the time, but he crushed me flat. I thought I was this rounded, three-dimensional person involved in all kinds of stuff, and a word from a stranger made me doubt myself. So I think that's a vivid and poignant example of how this identity threat or lack of identity safety can affect a person, and just like that. And in terms of health, you could think of it as kind of death by a million cuts. So the last couple of things I want to say about stereotype threat before I go on is it is a physiological thing. The response that leads people to do poorly on tests is physiological. There's a neurobiological basis for stereotype threat that they've found in their, these psychologists who can do all their just, controlled trials. And they find that under this threat condition, your affective neural networks are recruited, and that there's a functional dissociation between the cognitive and affective brain regions. So you lose as you become affected, you lose your ability to do well on the test. It's a kind of a zero-sum game of how much you're going, your neural abilities are focused on these affective issues or regions, and how much on cognitive. Claude Steele talks about it as stereotype threat takes up bandwidth. What I want to highlight is that activation of affective regions triggers activation of the biological stress process. And that makes perfect sense. When the tiger is about to jump on you, the proverbial tiger, you don't have time to think through, this might be dangerous, what should I do? You have fear, you immediately physiologically mobilize to fight or, to run away, or, well, probably run away, but maybe fight. And so when these things happen, you get increased blood pressure, heart rate, your temperature goes up. And this has been seen even in the test takers, who, by the way, don't report knowing any of this is happening. Again, I want to caution you about not taking perceived stress too seriously. And this they found mutable in individuals. They've used crossover designs, and again, these studies of Asian girls and women have looked at this too. So, okay, which one am I supposed to point at? Okay, so so people whose social identities place them in marginalized groups relative to others in the same setting can also be impacted by shared understandings of marginalizing social ideologies and environmental cues that aren't targeted specifically at them. So it doesn't have to be that someone rolls down their, car window and assaults you with a racial epithet. And it doesn't even have to be that you've been reminded you're a woman before you're about to take a math test. There are cues always in all of the settings we're in that that can affect us, and often not consciously. I like this example, though, again, it's sort of conscious, but I think it highlights the idea of that it doesn't have to be targeted at you to have the effect. So this was also from John Amichi's talk. He talked about a kid who had written to him, a basketball star at his college. He said, "Kobe's my favorite player, and now that's all changed. Because one day on TV, he could see Kobe's lip curl with contempt as Kobe said what he thought is the worst thing you can say about another man. He said that F word right there, big as life. That word this kid said in his email that he heard every single day, never directed at him because he's a black kid, basketball superstar, and therefore it's impossible for him to be gay. But the word was always around him. He made it sound like it swarmed him like a mosquito, sucking the life out of him one drop at a time, infecting him with despair." So again, this word, he saw it on TV, or he hears it, around campus, but not aimed at him, and it still can have this kind of effect. I also wanted to add that while some of the clearest studies we've done, look at hypertension or test performance in the case of Steele's and colleagues' work. In fact, when we're thinking about health, the reality is that many poor households are characterized by family comorbidity. Multiple family members suffer concurrent physical and mental health problems. So these weathering graphs of the hypertension, are kind of maybe, I don't know if I want to say tip of the iceberg, or maybe they're summarizing all these other things, but it wouldn't be quite right to think of it as just about hypertension. Poor black women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s are also primary caregivers not only of children, but also of ailing or disabled peers and elders. As a result of weathering, there's just enormous morbidity starting at early ages, and that puts people in young adulthood in very stressful positions. So for example, in a study by Linda Burton, and she did 3 sites, Boston, I think, San Antonio, and Chicago, I believe. She found that 80% of primary caregivers suffered multiple morbidities, so they themselves had at least 2 health problems, even though 83% of the primary caregivers were younger than 39. 72% of the children suffered multiple morbidities, and 68% of families had at least 2 people who suffered multiple morbidities. And women in Burton's study, families led highly challenging lives, and as one participant put it, could never get a break. And just to give you some examples to make it vivid, one of the cases was 30-year-old Francine, who was a primary caregiver of both her 6-year-old severely asthmatic son and her mother, who during the course of the ethnography suffered a stroke, a heart attack, and underwent tumor surgery. Francine herself developed stomach cancer, yet Burton and Whitfield noted that, like many of the mothers in the ethnography, Francine endured tremendous physical pain, going to the doctor only when the pain was unbearable and when she didn't have other folks to take care of. Another example was Barbara, who was 37, suffered from multiple chronic health problems, including diabetes, back injury, kidney problems, migraines, hernias, depression, and anxiety. And unfortunately, she was not unusual. This clearly poses some real social and family dilemmas. This early onset of chronic disease and functional limitations or accelerated aging, and also obviously excess death, result in hugely expanded caretaking needs, but a depletion of adult caregivers. And because many of these circumstances are low income, it's material circumstances that require much sweat equity. You can't just put that mother in the nursing home. You're the one who has to take care of her. And that's part of what I meant by shelter and storm. Obviously, it's good that you have worked out an autonomous protection for people to care for people as they age and become disabled at even young ages, or take care of orphans of people whose parents have died. But it's also enormously stressful to keep all of that up in these circumstances. And so these autonomous protections are very important. Things like kin networks to support family economies and caretaking systems in circumstances where you just couldn't have a nuclear family. I mean, not to say the nuclear family is worth having, but let's pretend we thought it was. It's just not tenable in these circumstances. A more collective ethos rather than an individualistic one offers protection from some of the primes in terms of validation and affirmation, but also, segregation can lead to ethnic density, which there's a lot of problems with segregation, but there might be one positive thing, which is ethnic density in your neighborhood, and alternative cultural frameworks to the framework that is marginalizing you. So having sort of a support system or a network or a neighborhood or whatever that shares a different value system and is affirming of you individually or of your group, those are all important roles that autonomous protective systems function to do. So is weathering only a metaphor? When I invented the word weathering, it was a metaphor. I was, a social researcher, and my interests were really in describing this whole phenomenon without measuring it. And I wish I could still do that, frankly, but I wouldn't be here today if I didn't quickly learn that you have to quantify things. But I've always resisted that to some extent. So is weathering only a metaphor, or can biological aging be measured or quantified? People asked me for decades, literally decades, is there some way to measure weathering? I'd get emails from doctoral students sometimes. I want to measure weathering. They want this one little measure. Colleagues, or I'd go give talks. Well, how do you measure weathering? That's all very nice and good. Someone else said, weathering's like pornography. I know it when I see it, but I can't, And I was happy to stay with that for a while. But the pressures to measure weathering continued. And as I said, we had kind of looked at it in these indirect ways, looking at hypertension, looking at allostatic load, looking at all kinds of health outcomes, but that wasn't good enough for anybody. They still said either what is the somehow there was supposed to be a psychometric test of weathering. I tell you, if any of you can come up with one, it just showed me they didn't get weathering at all, because it isn't something you could do some pen and pen. I don't think. Maybe I'm underestimating their abilities to make psychometric tests. But anyway, or they wanted some biological measured unit that wasn't hypertension, or wasn't some vague thing like allostatic load. And so introduce the telomere length. So some of you may be familiar with telomere length and others not, so let me just say a little about it. Telomere length in a subset of leukocytes called peripheral blood mononuclear cells has emerged as a intriguing new biomeasure of aging and possibly stress-mediated aging. And what telomeres are the stabilizing caps of the chromosomes, those things at the So that's the young chromosome and the old chromosome. I guess it's pretty, not exactly subtle. But as cells divide, the telomeres, which are these end caps that protect the chromosome and keep it stable, shorten. And eventually, as the cell divides more and more, it gets so short that it's useless and the cell either becomes senescent or dead. Because cell division is actually necessary to replenish damaged cells, senescence could theoretically pose a serious problem in tissues and organs when a critical number of cells are no longer dividing. And researchers also have found evidence that cellular senescence may be linked to inflammation and to increased cancer risk. And breaks in DNA structure due to oxidative stress in particular are not easily repaired in telomeres. And because oxidative stress is an important mechanism linking aging, psychosocial stress, biological stress activation, inflammation, and disease development, telomere length may serve as a powerful marker of overall biological versus chronological age. The measure of weathering in one little quantifiable unit. And in fact, in a study comparing white mothers whose mean age was 38, who were more or less stressed based on the fact of whether or not they were caring for an autistic child, Eppel et al. Found those facing the demands of caregiving for a special needs child had shorter telomeres than those who did not have those demands. And I should add that her sample was very homogeneous, not just white, but you could only get into the study if you had no underlying diseases. These were very upper class women in general. So I thought, well, if otherwise healthy and economically secure mothers could suffer such impacts from caregiving experiences in their 30s, it's reasonable to wonder how large the biological impact must be of engaging all the caregiving and other stressors that reproductive age women in poor or marginalized populations face. And I began to think about studying telomeres in relation to weathering. And it's a controversial in the sense that whether shortened telomeres are the cause of health problems or the consequences of great debate among molecular biologists. There seems to be more and more evidence that it may presage problems, but it certainly is also, I mean, it's probably both to some extent. But the nice part about using it to deal with a metaphor is that whether or not it sort of registers the cumulative effects of other aging determinants or is an aging determinant in itself, in either case, it may be a parsimonious indicator of weathering. Now, as it turned out, after that first study by Eppel, a rapidly growing set of studies started studying, analyzing small data sets or secondary data analysis or whatever where they could somehow add telomere length. And while we were busy developing our primary data collection study, many people started doing work on this much quicker than we could. And I'll say more about that later if you'd like. But what they found over and over again is that stressors of all kinds seem to be related to telomere length. So that seemed to become that's more or less established that those two things are linked. But when they looked at population differences like race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic position, very few people did. People were more interested in like the kind of stressors that, being crazy busy or, having an autistic child, which is quite a stressor. I don't mean to trivialize any of these stressors, but they're not quite the same thing as a whole population level structured stressor. So the very few that did look at population level got conflicting findings, some finding that SES or being Black was associated with shorter telomeres and others not, or the opposite even. Most study samples were highly select or clinical. There were very few that had race and socioeconomic measures. They were all social scientifically atheoretical and took more of a risk factor epidemiological approach, so seeing telomere length as now this, today's flavor of the month for the outcome variable, and let's see which of BMI, smoking, or not being married is associated with it. And none drew on any kind of local or socially situated knowledge. But the conventional wisdom now, based on a study that came out last fall that was considered sort of the gold standard because it was a secondary data analysis of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which obviously I've used quite a bit too, so I can't critique that too much, but I will here, but you'll see why. They had race and income, and they had no stressors, but they found that blacks, and the whole nation, so a big thing about nationally representative sample, they found African Americans had longer telomeres than whites, which is not what I would have predicted. And the way they write that up is they say African Americans in this study had longer telomeres than whites, consistent with several other studies. As I told you, there were very few other studies, and some came to one conclusion and some came to the other. So there were others that had found the blacks in their samples had longer, but there were ones that didn't. This finding is somewhat perplexing, given that African Americans have higher morbidity and mortality than whites. The measure of telomere length used in this study is an average of telomere length across all leukocyte cell types, including neutrophils, et cetera, and monocytes. Previous research suggests that within the same individual, telomere length in different cell type varies. Given evidence of black-white differences in leukocyte cell subpopulations, future work should attempt to assess telomere length in a single cell type, such as monocytes, to determine whether racial ethnic heterogeneity in cell types explains why African Americans have longer overall TL than whites. Well, I wouldn't have gone there, but so now we have to go to these subpopulations of cells to find where's that essential difference. But this is if you go to talks, this is what people will tell you. Blacks have longer telomeres than whites, and this probably has to do with something in their subpopulations of cell types. So I was a little thrown off. And I looked at all the studies that agreed with that finding, as well as all the studies that didn't. And I found that there were two that basically agreed. One was a study based on 50 white and 20 black children out of 16,000 original participants who were born in the 1970s in the Bogalusa, Louisiana town, which is semi-rural. It's the Bogalusa Heart Study, as you might guess, and controlled for no social covariate. So it's sort of like, why would you believe anything from that? Another study whose title was actually Leukocyte Telomeres Are Longer in African Americans Than Whites, which I immediately thought always wrong, never in doubt. But anyway, used the same sample and then also added a quickie analysis of another sample where once again, they had no social covariates. The only thing they controlled for was age and BMI. They even missed smoking, which really struck me. And they go all the way to age 93. And you can already begin to think, if you're looking at 93-year-olds and you're not controlled, what did I do now? I'm sorry.
It's this one. Let's see if I can get it back.
Okay. Well, while he's working on that, oh, thank you.
That one's the bad button.
Okay, the bad button. I'll go back to my rock. Anyway, I think, is this where I was? Is this where I was?
I think one back.
Okay. You have a very select group of blacks if you're going all the way up to 93, so that they have longer telomeres might not be surprising. And meanwhile, they completely dismissed findings from analyses of the MESA and SWAN data, which did include some social covariates and found evidence of shorter TL among blacks or Latinos in the case of MESA compared to white respondents. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they so forcefully acted as if now they had found the truth. And I also wondered, why? Why is everybody accepting this? And there are some obvious reasons. Again, it was N. Haynes, national sample. They did have social covariates. It was done by the primary researchers at the University of Michigan, so you can't blame them for wanting to think it was a good study. But when you think about it, it seems a little premature, given all the evidence and given the theory. And that's where I think theory matters too. So does this prove that African Americans have longer telomeres than whites? And if it does, what does that mean? That all cumulative stress hypotheses are wrong? That TL is not a good measure of the toll stress takes on the body? What I found very interesting is that the same people who would say this isn't now known still believe that stress shortens telomeres length. Well, how do you have that both be true? And they still believe there's racial inequalities in health, and that they're due to social structural things. So it doesn't all add up if you think it through. And if I had one kind of thing to implore people is it's important to think through your findings and not just treat it as this sort of game, well, you test this and you test that, and if it says this, then there's the answer. So in that vein, there were limitations in that study, as there are in every study. But the ones I want to highlight and that lead to my study, which was happening at the same time. Since mine was primary data collection, we started way before and ended way after. And in fact, I was even on the study section that funded the study. And I was thinking, oh my God, they're going to get this done quick. But anyway, their national survey sample is underpowered for the study of the poorest whites, blacks, and Latinos. And if weathering is mutable and sensitive to life experience, social context, and environmental exposures, the assumption that a randomly selected low-income US white, black, or Latino is representative of all comparably low-income whites, blacks, or Latinos cannot be taken as axiomatic across time and place. In fact, just so you know, we had thought about using N. Haynes first. Obviously, I've used it many, many times. And to really focus in on the poorest whites, we would have had to lose 85% of the sample. So that was why we didn't do it. They had no psychosocial stressor covariate. And then I have these beliefs like don't let facts stand in the way of a good theory. But I like the way Albert said it better. I don't understand a thing about relativity, but he has some great quotes. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And that's sort of my mantra. So, do I still have time? Just got to my...
Everybody would agree that you can take as much time as you want.
Okay. So here's our study, telomere length in black, white, and Latino Detroit residents. And they're my co-authors who are all indispensable for various reasons. So I want to talk about the study, what we did, as well as what we found. So this was an interdisciplinary collaborative effort using a community-based participatory research approach. So rather than secondary data analysis, we established, and this is part of why it took us so long, we established relationships in Detroit with a range of community partners that took years to establish. They were initially established for other purposes by one of my colleagues, Amy Schultz. But for us to be able to, we added to these data for this study and also drew blood, which is not something you easily do in Detroit. It took I think it took about 2 to 3 years for me meeting with them just to be able to do the study, despite the good relations they already had with other of my Michigan colleagues. So that's part of what takes so long. But it's worth it, I think. And I could talk about that if you want to. The study used a stratified multi-stage probability sample of residents aged 25 and older in 3 neighborhoods in Detroit. East Side, Northwest, and Southwest is what we're called in the Healthy Environments Partnership. We refer to that as HEP, and those are the 3 HEP neighborhoods. The way we thought about the weathering model in this context was that historical race-conscious ideology is a fundamental cause of poor urban health, acting to segregate blacks into low-income communities, spur sustained disinvestment in these communities, encourage white flight and maybe a little gentrification back, create a stigma of place stamped with the stigma of race, limit educational, employment, and material opportunities for all low-income residents in urban areas with predominantly black populations, overburden networks, degrade and decay physical environments, weaken municipal infrastructure, induce anger or hopelessness, and create psychosocial status incongruity for whites left behind, and weaken or disrupted coping resources. So what I want to be clear, this isn't a story saying whites have it worse than anyone else. But it is a story that's saying that if you're a white person who's living in Detroit, or in a similarly divested, victim of structural racism, that in fact, at a minimum, you're suffering a lot of the same deprivations that might affect your health. But in fact, because white folks may feel entitled or have not developed autonomous protections or accept the dominant cultural framework rather than having an alternative one, that in some ways they could experience a status incongruity that would be a psychosocial threat to them in that setting only. Well, there may be others, but I want to be clear that the important thing is that if you really believe that there's no such thing essentially as white or black, then you have to realize there are places where whites are going to do badly. Or at least hypothesize that. Now, to add to these structural problems and policy disruptions that happened in many cities towards the end of the 20th century, there has also been, as many of you probably know, a kind of austerity urbanism after the banking crisis of 2008. And the good thing about how long it took us to do this study is we were able to collect data after the banking crisis. So I guess the banking crisis was fortuitous for us. I'm making fun of people who get excited when they see their results and they show that some group that they thought were doing terribly were doing terribly. Anyway, so what's austerity urbanism? If you want to learn more about it, I recommend reading Jamie Peck. But the way he talks about it is manifestations of devolved austerity are becoming increasingly evident at the urban scale across the country. In important respects, this represents an incipient fiscal crisis for the local government sector as a whole in the USA, but it is also a distinctly urban crisis, in the sense that the cities have been hit especially hard by the housing slump and the parallel wave of mortgage foreclosures, in the sense that cities are disproportionately reliant on public services, and in the sense that they are home to many of the preferred political targets of austerity programs: the undeserving poor, minorities and marginalized populations, public sector unions, and bureaucratized infrastructures. As he puts it, cities are therefore where austerity bites. And so they're sort of at the leading and bleeding edge of austerity. And so if we think in that context, one could certainly imagine effects of these multiple stressors induce weathering among residents, which could be expressed as accelerated aging gauged by telomere length, our new quantifiable measure of weathering, and that the pattern of weathering across racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups will reflect harsh conditions for all residents of Detroit, and also variation among groups in structured identity safety. Detroit is quite a place, and I won't go into all this for time, but Jeff Eugenides, who's a novelist and writes always about Detroit, has some very interesting, who grew up there, has interesting things to say about it. But what you need to know is that Detroit has severe race-based residential segregation and has suffered enormous disinvestment, population outmigration, and the economic divestment over the past 5 decades have reduced its population from almost 2 million to less than 1 million. Out-migration of middle and high socioeconomic status whites has been dramatic. Today, 85% of Detroit's residents are African American. In 1950, it was 30%. The Latino population has been a significant presence in Southwest Detroit since the 1940s, but it grew substantially after 1965 and especially in the 1990s. It's quite a case of austerity urbanism. Its problems of poverty, disinvestment, and shrinking tax base, for all the reasons that it happened in many cities in the late 20th century, is now being intensified by austerity urbanism, and has culminated in Detroit, as you've probably read in the papers, with first an emergency manager, who's often referred to as a dictator, just subverted the entire democratic process in Detroit to take over the city and filed the largest Chapter 9 municipal bankruptcy in US history. And Detroit, just to give a sense of just how much it's suffering from this accumulation of first the macroeconomic restructuring and now the austerity urbanism, there are 78,000 abandoned buildings in Detroit, and those are the totally abandoned ones. The streetlights are largely dysfunctional. Pay and pensions in the public service workforce have been ended, renegotiated, lowered. And so one might think severe austerity urbanism may now also impact the health of Detroit residents. And to give a sense also of the ideology here, is that when a lot of the streetlights either were broken or were actively turned off, that was seen as a responsible reduction in local services to deal with the fiscal crisis. And they even removed 1,300 streetlights, and they left only a few hundred, not all of them working, in so-called strategic locations. And then the mayor encouraged everyone to turn on their porch lights. And it's estimated that 40% of Detroit is now in darkness, largely as a result of creeping system failure, long-term budget shortfalls, and selectively abandoned maintenance efforts. And the mayor has been attempting to privatize the streetlight system as a good austerity policy person would, but so far there aren't any takers. So we did our study in Detroit from 2008 to 2011. And so we have our outcome variable, telomere length. We have explanatory variables, including age, sex, race, ethnicity, poverty to income ratio, highest level of education, some psychosocial stressors, including safety stress, perceived unfair treatment, neighborhood physical environment, negative social interactions, neighborhood satisfaction, anger, hopelessness, smoking, and BMI. And following our conceptual model, we regress these in a series of nested models. I'm not going to go all through that today because I couldn't if given the time, but I do want to get to the bottom line and how that relates to the more general points I'm making. Again, this just shows you how poor how poor everybody is in Detroit. So the Detroit is the left-hand bar, and the national figure for that population, or for that income level, is the right-hand bar. So you can see why we would have had to throw out almost all whites if we used a national sample. And when we looked at the distributions between the blacks, whites, and Latino in our population, they're much more comparable than national average. And in terms of poverty, they're very close, whereas whites in the US are much less likely to be poor than either of the other groups. In Detroit, they're actually a little more likely to be poor. So you'd think now we would find that if you looked in Detroit, blacks would have lower telomere lengths or the same telomere lengths. Well, the first analyses were a little disconcerting. When we just looked overall and only controlling for age and gender, we got sort of what the others that we've been castigating were getting. Statistically speaking, all the groups were the same. There was no difference. So in some sense, that's a little bit of vindication, because it says if you've got this homogeneous group exposed to the same horrible situations and all poor. But there was a little sign, the trend was for the blacks to be larger, longer. So we could declare victory and go home and just say that they're all, statistically speaking, the same, but we didn't. We kept looking, well, we were always planning to look at all these other variables, but I'm just saying, when we got this very first crude thing, it was a surprise. But then when we broke it down by poverty, it started to change pretty dramatically. And among the non-poor, whites had, again, statistically, they aren't different. But whites had the highest, the longest, and it's good to have long telomeres. And Latinas had is this women? Yeah, had the shortest, but the same was true for men. I just had to pick a group and an age to compare on. But among the poor, it went the other direction, and there were even statistically significant differences. So among the poor, Latinas were the biologically youngest Latina 45-year-olds in this instance, and whites were the biologically oldest. So that was intriguing. To cut to the chase, when we controlled for a variety of the things we controlled for, they made a big difference. Some made more of a difference than others. Some made more of a difference in one group than in another group. It wasn't just, there were clearly interactions going on. But if we just take the two models, the one that I just showed you, which is when we have controlled for poverty already, so it's not the most unadjusted model. And then when we put in the variety of stressors, the only group that sort of remained statistically significantly lower than non-poor whites were poor whites. But even there, a chunk of the difference was explained. And when we got to the Latinos, they started doing really well. And in fact, if we look only comparing the poor and non-poor within each group, so not compared to whites all the time, but compared to themselves, again, the whites are still statistically significantly shorter and have the shortest telomeres. The things we controlled for took care of all the difference by SES among the blacks, and the Latinos got even better. So what does this all mean? Well, it means a lot of different things, but let me just say a few of them. I think it's an indictment of simple risk factor epidemiology. I think if you add this to the whole mix of the results people have found, it's just not good enough to put in the risk factor of the months and an outcome, and then look at across the whole nation and actually call that a strength that you're looking at the whole nation. If you really believe theoretically that what's happening in specific environments and social situations and structural locations matters, and if you have to throw out most of the whites, if you're looking nationally, if you want to try and get as close as you can to that 2x2 table where they're close to the other groups in certain conventional measures of socioeconomic status. Non-poor whites had the longest estimated telomere length, but poor whites had the shortest. So that's pretty much doesn't seem to fit with a true race effects idea. And if you looked at any group, there were differences by different variables. So I would argue that the findings in earlier studies were likely due to severe residual confounding. And I would also then say unobserved heterogeneity matters a lot. It's back to what you can't count everything, and not everything you can count matters. There are huge differences in the life experiences of different groups with different social locations and at different historical moments, and there's no way social science or epidemiology is ever going to be able to measure all of them. Even if it can come up with telomere length to measure weathering, it can't come up with measuring all the unobserved, unobservable, socially situated local factors that matter. And we're not claiming that our results have captured all that. They can't possibly have. But even with adding the few measured variables we added that came out of our theories and a more structural perspective, we saw very volatile, very unstable coefficients. And so I would say the evidence is consistent with a conceptual understanding of race ethnicity and its health impacts as contingent, relational, dynamic, constant, context-dependent, and fluid. Obviously, you always have more research to do. Some ideas, some possible interpretations that might then be tested. Is that stressors specific to urban life contribute to telomere shortening? The impacts of these stressors seem to vary by race ethnicity. Structural racism working through segregation, disinvestment, and austerity measures in urban areas with predominant black populations may impact and pattern telomere length in complex ways. It's important to use a threshold PIR, and that's a methodological point I could tell you more about if you're interested. It's important to draw, to some extent, from historical, local, political, and ethnographic knowledge. Part of the value of working in the community partnerships is we were able to do that, as well as what we had already sort of known from past work. We were very interested in whether the differences in the telomere length among the poor and non-poor and the Latinos were related to nativity, because there's certainly a lot of work that might suggest that hypothesis. We didn't have the numbers to really look at it, but I will tell you that 80% of the poor were immigrants, and only 20% of the higher SES were immigrants. The influence of place on health may be modified by the relationship of individual race ethnicity to the racial ethnic composition of the community and the contingencies of social identity that follow. Spatially rooted social ties may be a protective resource for historically poor and marginalized groups. And maybe what's happening with the whites, and we have nothing in this particular study to measure this, so this is speculative, but we're trying to think how to look at this more empirically. With the exodus of whites and jobs from Detroit, the shrinking benefits of labor union membership, the whites were disproportionately the ones who were able to be in labor unions for reasons that were also racist, and public pensions, and the overall reduction in taxation-based city services, the whites who remain may be particularly adversely affected by the social and ecological consequences of austerity urbanism. Lacking both the financial resources, networks, and identity affirmation that Detroit whites could count on in the past, and the alternative social coping mechanisms for pooling risk and resources and protecting social identity established by historically marginalized groups such as blacks and Latinos, Detroit whites may have less to buffer them from the health effects, or Detroit poor whites may have less to buffer them from the health effects of of poverty, stigma, anxiety, or hopelessness in this setting. So in future TL research, I would hope, though I doubt I will see this, but I would really hope that investigators of TL and health disparities would continue to wrestle with the ways varying social histories and current social realities contribute to racial ethnic differences in health, ideally in interdisciplinary research teams or community-based research partnerships. And continued research is needed to identify the ways that various constellations of material, psychosocial, or environmental stressors grounded in different social contexts may affect telomere length and health vulnerability more broadly among racialized groups. And that's it. And I'd like to thank all the places that funded this and various collaborators along the way.
Thank you very much. Very captivating talk. Remind me that I need to stand by the mic. So if you haven't been to one of the RWJ talks before we open it up to Q&A, we have a couple of our PhD students that we call initial brief discussions, kind of get the ball rolling. How this operates is they get a few of the readings from the distinguished speaker in advance. We talk about that as a group within our center, and that generates a couple of questions that hopefully will get us rolling into Q&A. Before I forget, there was a lot of potential questions for longer discussions than we probably will have time for in this room. Fortunately, Dr. Nina Wallerstein and her folks at New Mexico Cares, the Health Disparity Center here at the medical school, are hosting a post-talk, if there's such a thing, right after we finish up here in family practice room 302, which I believe is just right around the corner. So without further ado, our two discussants will be Yoshiro Macias Mejia and Melina Juarez. I don't know if you two paper, rock, scissors to see who's going to go first or. Cool. And remember, speak from the mic, and for folks that are going to ask questions here at the mic so they can capture it up.
Thank you for that talk. That was kind of amazing to hear all these different things and the different studies that you presented. So there's a lot of focus on people that have the negative health effects, and we're wondering if there's any research on the people that have positive health outcomes and how they're resilient, how are they surviving these conditions. So if you can tell us if there's anything that's looking at that.
Well, I think that's a false dichotomy. And what I mean by that is, often when people bring that up, they're thinking, there must be some kind of resilience factors in individuals, and you could see who's resilient and who isn't resilient, or maybe they had a mentor. They're thinking very often on an individual level, and this is very much population-oriented. But the other thing is, when I refer to autonomous protections and things like that, I was talking about the very protective but high-effort coping strategies that many people in oppressed populations use. So things that would be called resilience by somebody else would be high-effort coping in this context, and it triggers stress processes too. So because it's structural in this way, there's no way any individual can, maybe some incredibly lucky individual who won the genetic lottery as an individual, not as a member of a group, and everything just had a fairy godmother. But for the most part, the people are making, usually this story is told in terms of resilience, or people who make good choices versus bad choices, or who are making responsible, that's other word used a lot, responsible ones, or doing the right things, getting married, having kids, after they're married and after they're teenagers, and et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm saying, this is totally different from that. I'm suggesting that, first of all, everybody does, again, this is distributional. Groups do things in their own, for their own affirmation and survival. And so if we don't understand why some group is having kids mostly in their teen years, then we have to figure out why that's advantageous instead of just assuming that it's wrong and that's why they have these other health problems. But also, that if you're taking this stress physiology perspective, life is stressful, and engaging life is stressful, and having sustained cognitive and emotional engagement with the tough parts of life is stressful. Then you add all these environmental issues. So I guess I would say the group that isn't having these problems is the population groups who don't have to suffer from these multiple assaults on their stress physiology. To wit, most often it would be, say, whites or white men, or I don't know, I don't want to be trite here, but you have to totally change the structure. It's not that you can find some factor that some individual or some group in Detroit. Now, at the same time, as I said, weathering isn't a matter of just lying down and dying and being a victim. Probably if you just lay down, you might not weather so much. There's active, effortful coping. There's active, collective responses. But they're not the same as addressing those structural factors that put you behind the 8 ball in the first place.
Hi. So my question deals with actually taking this into policy. How do we actually get this information that's very interesting and that's very important to policymakers in order to reduce these stressors, or how can we do this? Is this even possible?
Depends how depressed I'm feeling on a given day. That's sort of the existential question. I certainly believe nothing good will come of not talking about it or finding out more about it. So I don't think it's a reason not to do this. Those of you who I'll be meeting with tomorrow will have read, I've drawing on some of the social identity thread, I've started thinking about this concept I call Jedi public health, which is about disrupting cues and settings, and whether those settings are classrooms or whether they're whole communities or whole nations is another, whatever level you're drawn to. But it's kind of the anti-pharmacological personalized medicine policy with a huge P approach. And so that's just, I wrote a paper in this anthology thanks to Nancy, because I don't think I would have written the paper if you hadn't invited me. So, and now we're going to have a meeting in June where I'm bringing together people from the Claude Steele and a lot of the people who've done the stereotype threat interventions with stress physiologists to kind of see if we can brainstorm and think of anything. Now, after that meeting, if you ask me that question, I might be all buoyed by all the great ideas that came up with it, or I might be really depressed because we didn't come up with any. But that's where I'm kind of headed more than policy with a big P. Obviously, there are obvious policies that a lot of people are working on that would probably make a difference, a positive difference. So politically, they're probably not that feasible right now, and especially under austerity. This austerity neoliberal ideology is making it very hard to do anything, especially at local levels. But I think the other thing about the Jedi public health is it might be a way to infiltrate. It doesn't seem like policy with a big P. But I don't have a good answer for you. I think it's important, part of why I came here or why I give talks is, I have a hard time to some extent, you might not believe this because you've seen things I published and some of the accolades I eventually got, but I have a hard time publishing my work in general. And it's very controversial, if you didn't know that already. And so I think there's something to just doing it anyway, trying to talk about it even if I can't get it published, having students. I think I'm hopeful for all of you guys to possibly be better at figuring out how to apply this to the real world than I've been able to do. So I throw the ball back at you.
Audience, questions? Please step to the microphone.
It's a very pragmatic question, which is, how expensive is it to measure telomeres?
Well, that's why there are two reasons our sample size isn't bigger. The biggest one is probably cost. There's no home rapid test, although, as wouldn't surprise you, the biochemists, molecular biologists, folks who are actually some of the co-authors on that long list, who have pretty much put telomere length on the map, have now started a business called Telome Health, with the idea that they, will be all ready when. I don't understand it. I'm not second guessing them, but I'm just saying I don't know what you would do with it. If you had the knowledge of your own telomere length, or if your physician had it, I'm not quite sure what you would do with that. Yeah. So there may be, the point is there may be a home test in the not too distant future. But right now, I forget what it costs, but it costs a lot. Because, and if you take the whole thing where you're drawing blood and, it's just a quite a process. Now, a study we're doing now is trying to see, there are a variety of studies. Some people are starting to use DNA saliva DNA. It would be very easy, but it has not been validated, though they claim it has, but it has not been validated for use. So we're trying to see if it is, because we want it to be for exactly the reason you're saying. And there's also banked DNA, and every major study in the universe has started banking DNA just in case there's some use for it. But the problem is that the way they immortalize the cells can affect telomere length. So it's not obvious you can use it. Some people use it anyway. You need to be careful when you read their studies because it hasn't been validated. But we're currently doing a study where we're collecting blood again in Detroit and also in Ann Arbor. And we're going to measure the same people's telomere length, the expensive way, the saliva way, which we're also collecting, and going to the most expensive thing is immortalizing the cells and kind of simulating what's in banked DNA stores across the country, or world. And so when we're done with that study, we should have an answer to whether or not you can use some of these cheaper forms or already banked cells, but we don't know it yet. Jane.
Arlene, taking the cue from the Sentencing Project that indicates that young black men 18 to 45 are disproportionately in jail. They should be the demographic that is most stressed of all black men, and they have been pulled out of your ability to get the data.
Well, they aren't totally pulled out. We don't have currently incarcerated people, so in that sense you're right. But since it was community-based and so many black men have been incarcerated, we actually do have a lot who have been incarcerated. So they're not, and I guess I would hesitate to be sure who's the most stressed. I think we have a stylized wisdom that black men are the most stressed, that the ones in prison are the most stressed, and on a scale, they're all way high, and I'm, again, not trying to say that those aren't incredibly major stressors. But part of what I think people may have missed is how stressful it is to be the people still at home when someone else is, that's another way of losing part of your network, to be the one who has to cope every day and do all the sustained cognitive and emotional engagement with the stressors. So part of why I like to show that hypertension slide where the black women have the worst hypertension rates is I think it's a little up for grabs who's the most stressed, but we can all agree that they're an incredibly stressed group.
And the highest levels of testosterone are found with men who are in prison, because they got to be up there ready all the time. And I would just guess that that's one of the most stressed populations. And it would be nice if you added them
while they were incarcerated,
you might find that they're losing a lot of telomere length at a young age.
That could be it, and I just don't know if we'll ever be able to do that. But thank you. I just wanted to also say that I probably wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Jane, because at a point in my career where everyone was telling me that I should leave academia for the good of mankind, she was the one person who said otherwise. So she was my alternative cultural framework to the one that was marginalizing me.
I really like your perspective on the importance of context. I know that Detroit and sort of that area, Dearborn in general, have the largest Arab population in the United States. I know you guys didn't study them, but how would they fit?
In this ecology? That's a hard one. I don't know a lot about it, so I can't give you a satisfactory answer. We've actually wanted to include them, but it's harder, or so far we don't have a good entree there, and so that might take a few more years of And there's also how did they fit in before September 11th and how did they fit in after. But mostly they live among themselves very largely. They have a vibrant, in terms of alternative cultural framework and ethnic density, to the extent those things matter, you'd think they'd be in good shape, but that's all speculation. I don't know, but that would be fascinating. And I wish, and maybe we will be able to do that.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your talk. Along the lines of being involved in Jedi public health,
Yes.
did I hear you correctly say that this is an indictment of risk factor epidemiology?
I did, and I need to remember I'm being taped, and I probably shouldn't have said that, but yes.
No. I think that's a great term, and I was,
Okay.
because I agree with you. And I was just wondering if you would expand upon that a little bit more for people as we talk about this, because that's an important policy question that deals with education and health sciences. The fact that we concentrate so much on risk factors rather than protective factors and buffers. I think probably answered my own question, but I'd like to hear more from you.
There you go. I meant a couple of things by that point. One is the one you're highlighting, which is we look at deficiencies rather than strengths and risks rather than protective factors. And my own view is they all matter, and they all, some of the risk factors, some things that people think of as risk factors might actually be protective, and some of the things that are protective may actually be part of the storm. So I also think we don't even necessarily know what's what, and that you need to have more ethnographic and other kinds of studies and voices from communities to help figure that out in each context. But the other thing I meant about it is that it seems to me epidemiology writ large and social epidemiology also has become sort of, you pick a health problem and then you put in a few poorly measured variables. Well, some of them might be measured well. You can probably measure weight really well, though there's a lot of, controversy about BMIs and whether you should be doing waist circumference or, what. But still, there are some really measurable things. So I shouldn't just say measured poorly, but the social factors are always measured poorly because social factors always are. And you put in those few things, and then you see how they statistically, what statistically sort of rises to the top in the model that has everything. And then you say those are the risks, and that's what we've learned. And there's no theory very often that it comes from other than, if we're talking about social epidemiology, social things matter, which they do, but that's kind of a broad, vague theory. No, this unobserved heterogeneity or the bad measurement issues, the error in measurement is not talked about a lot. Or that if you find results that are completely counterintuitive, it's not that they're not right, and that's the whole point of doing empirical studies, is we don't just go with our prejudices and priors. We still go with them because we are human, but it's sort of, we try to have something else as well to test them. But that doesn't mean that the thing you counted and studied statistically is telling you the right answer. And if you have a whole body of evidence, and if even things you're studying or saying in talks completely, contradict what you're saying your findings are, then you have to reconcile them at least, not just say, well, in this study, and in this, and that's part of what I'm concerned about with risk factor epidemiology, that you can find people, who, as that example, I think illustrated, that are very, the first author of that is a wonderful person and was actually a Robert Wood Johnson scholar. Very talented, not here, but not at Michigan either. But anyway, which is too bad because we would have maybe been able to help her. But that's all facetious. People don't. I need to stop saying things like this when I'm being taped because most people don't. Okay.
Perfectly honest statement.
Okay.
And it's matched to a larger proof or truth that we need to do within health science and education. You know, the fact that, you know, with our work with the Institute for Race and Social Justice, one of the things we looked at was white logic and white methodologies. You know, and one of the things I would always want to argue in terms of risk factor epidemiology is that we put too much emphasis on risk factors rather than thinking about protective factors and buffers and providing resources to people to continue to strengthen those ways. And that's one way of dismantling some of the oppression, some of the structural things that we see. But we have a system that says, we'll talk about it, let's keep talking about it as a risk factor. And as a result of that, we're always looking at disparities rather than inequities. Anyway, so
Yeah.
don't stop talking about
Okay.
it.
Well, I'm also referring to my little facetious comments that people who don't know my brand of humor might think I was serious about.
Any other questions before we move on to the after party? Thank you very much. Wonderful.